Last year, the volume of the global tourism market reached $9 trillion. Tourism accounts for 10% of the global GDP and employs over 300 million people. Approximately 25% of the world's tourism market falls on ecotourism, the fastest growing sector in the industry. The number of eco-tourists annually increases by 20%.
Over
the past few years, we did our best to hit as many different eco-routes as possible, both in our country and abroad. We compared different types of tourism, tried to slice and dice the economy of the industry, talked to specialists and common locals, knowing the situation inside out. The goal of our show is to demonstrate to the Kazakh TV channel audience the most successful tourism practices. The concept of national parks was born in the late 19th century in the US based on the constitutional right of citizens to communicate with wildlife. In national parks, whatever economic activities except for tourism were prohibited in order to keep them in their original condition. The corresponding land was withdrawn from economic turnover for the sake of people's happiness. That was exactly what the first law on national parks said. Yet, by the end of the 20th century, the aesthetic needs of urban residents to communicate with nature grew so much that the number of national park visitors became millions. It was obvious that it had to be limited somehow. The term ecotourism was first used by a Mexican ecologist, Hector Lascarain, in 1983. Back then, environmentalists were concerned about the increasing attendance of national parks and were debating the allowed recreational load with businessmen and politicians. How to strike a balance between recreation and ecology. The core ideas of ecotourism are the rejection of the cult of comfort and consumption of mass tourist goods, and instead promotion of other values, spiritual enrichment via communication with nature. At the same time, ecotourism is supposed to help local residents to cover their economic needs. According to World Tourism Organization, 700 million tourists spent $470 billion on international travel in 2000. Of these, about 7% deliberately traveled outside their home countries to visit various nature sites. In 2019, nearly 1.5 billion tourists spent $9 trillion on international travel. The World Tourism Organization classified about 25% of them as eco-tourists. Yet, different organizations understand the concept of ecological tourism somewhat differently. Today, our film crew is heading to the Kolsai-Kolderi National Park. We are very lucky as we got invited to take part in a scientific expedition to study the snow leopard and to participate in a working meeting of the park's staff with the representatives of the UN Development Program and experts of other organizations engaged in sustainable environmental management. Kolsai-Kolderi is one of the most popular national parks in Almaty region. The Kolsai Lakes eco-route stretches almost till the very watershed divide of the northern Tian Shan. It goes through all altitudinal belts, which allows tourists to get an overall picture of the rich and diverse Tian Shan's nature in just 3 to 4 hours. Lake Kaindi is yet another popular tourist route and destination. It formed due to an earthquake in 1911. The centennial trunks of Tian Shan spruces are still rising above the water surface, reminding of that natural disaster that caused many troubles a century ago, but also created such a beauty for us to enjoy. In winter, there are not that many tourists around, but in summer, strings of people are endlessly flowing here every day in both directions. The joint brainstorming at the working meeting in the office of the Kolsai-Kolderi National Park identified the best suitable solutions to enhance the management of wildlife resources. The main questions are how to build up the park's cost-effectiveness and how to satisfy the needs of local residents while at the same time preserving the local wildlife abundance and diversity, especially taking account of the fact that local ecosystems are already seriously suffering. Environmental organizations make proposals and help national parks with modern technologies, equipment and expert support. As to the overall structure of the management plan, firstly, money should be allocated from the national budget. Secondly, we need to attract sponsors. Thirdly, nature-related organizations like our park can and should be making their own profit. The team has calculated the recreational load for each route separately. Accordingly, there might be a need to develop a motivation system to attract more visitors during weekdays and to limit their number during weekends. Another very important initiative is in the center of today's discussion. The working group is considering 2 more plots to expand the park's premises, from its eastern border to the Sioux River and the left bank of the Jibek River and the Jedediah River Valley in the north. The names Taban Karagai Forest Cottage and Jenishki are familiar to all travelers, tourists, hunters and fishermen of Almaty region. Still children, we read the books of Kazakh naturalist writers about these gorgeous places. In the 50s of the last century, they even brought 10 aurochs here thinking of organizing a Kazakh Belaveshskaya Pushcha. Hoofed animals really love this place. By now their populations have significantly reduced, so many specialists advocate the inclusion of these territories into the official area of the national park. In places where the grazing load is exceeded, the land degrades and wild animals get deprived of their usual habitats. Therefore, grazing in national parks is regulated by science-based calculations and limits. The presence of wild animals in the area attracts ecotourists and money. Unlike nature reserves, national parks do not prohibit economic activity. Instead, they seek to make it environmentally sustainable. The task of local residents is not only to earn their living but also to keep wildlife in such a state that their children and grandchildren can also earn their living here. For example, we already have one checkpoint. So why building another one nearby? Because we need to develop recreational tourism. If there's a small hotel here, then the forester's wife, who's now just sitting at home, can work. Otherwise, after her husband retires, she will not have income of her own, because she had no official employment and thus will not be entitled to retirement benefits. Thus, both spouses will work. We talked about the socially significant issue at a gender seminar. In national parks, cars can be used only along approved routes. It is forbidden to build new roads and drive on new ground. Talgat Seitovich Kerteshov, UNDP project manager, has shared his impressions of the trip to the US national parks.
Америку копировать не сможем, это однозначно, но какие-то вещи...
We will not be able to copy the US, no doubt about it. Yet we can adopt certain things. Something that US rangers are only catching poachers, which is totally wrong. Within his plot, each ranger ensures protection, as well as establishes good relations with the locals. He's like an outreach officer. These are the functional responsibilities of our inspectors today. The International Ecotourism Society defines ecotourism as a socially responsible journey through natural territories, contributing to wildlife protection and improving the well-being of the local population. The fines for the premises of specially protected natural territories are 10 times higher, and sometimes this fact leads to tensions. To prevent this, we need to engage with the population. There are different target groups like school children, rural youth, farmers, elders councils, and rural archimats. The definition of ecotourism used by the Worldwide Fund for Nature says almost the same, but in somewhat different terms. The fund's experts see ecotourism as traveling to places with virgin nature which does not disrupt the integrity of ecosystems and creates economic conditions in which nature protection becomes beneficial for local population. To manage wildlife resources sustainably, one should possess as much reliable information about them as possible. Thus, every national park has a science department. Since 2013, jointly with the Zoology Institute, we have been studying the territorial distribution and population size of snow leopard and other so-called indicator and endangered species. Collaborating with the UNDP, we have acquired 30 photo traps, and soon you will have a chance to see the results of our observations. We have mapped all encounter points, not only within the limits of the national park, but also outside it. This data is quite useful, especially for the purpose of expanding the overall park's area. Daniar Togambayev, National Parks Director, thanked all meeting participants for their insights and proposals, as well as expressed hope that in the future joint work will lead to the most optimal outcomes. After the meeting, the guests are returning back home, and we will join the wild animal counting mission headed by candidate of biological sciences Kamit Akhmetov. Alexei Grachov, head of the Mammals Laboratory, is preparing maps and uploading the necessary navigation data to the cell phones of the mission members. Zoologists Altenbek Zhenespaev and Saltores Apabayev, experienced snow leopard specialists, are acquainting young inspectors with accounting methods. We conduct wildlife winter counts every year. We will now distribute accounting logs among our inspectors who will go on different routes. We will be observing the ungulates visually. For predatory species, we will use the track method. You are all familiar with your routes as you have been doing this for several years now. Please don't forget to turn on your GPSs so that the whole route gets properly registered. I hope everyone knows how to distinguish Marten and Ermine tracks. Marten's step is much longer and the track itself is larger. A professional inspector should know the forest and all its inhabitants like the back of his hand, including animal and bird tracks.
Но одной из основных задач сейчас является
сделать повторную оценку.
One of our main tasks is to reassess the snow leopard population. It's really important to ensure the high quality of animal counts within the national park's limits. We will combine two counting methods: the classic winter route counting and the photo traps. The briefing is over and off goes the expedition. The team splits into several groups, each of which will follow its own route. Every year, counting is done on the same routes. These are wolf tracks. They are coming really close to the checkpoint.
Справа это вот южный склон, южный мокрый склон Заилийского Алатау.
On your right, you see the southern slopes of the Transilli Alatau. Practically no snow, as you can see, even in winter. On your left, there's the northern macro slope of the Kungay Alatau. In winter, when the water level is quite low in the Sheyenne River and the course is not as rapid as in summer, snow leopards move between the Transilli and Kungay Alatau mountains.
Алатау, Заилийский Алатау и обратно.
Alexander Formozov, a famous zoologist, developed the winter route counting or WRC method in the first half of the 20th century based on a mathematical formula allowing to calculate animal species population density by the number of tracks crossing a special counting line. The Formozov's formula also includes a correction factor to take account of the average length of an animal's daily travel and the angle at which animals cross the counting line. For example, whereas a mouse can walk about 50 meters per day, a wolf or a snow leopard can go as far as 20-30 kilometers.
С появлением фотоловушек представление о состоянии популяции снежного барса.
With the photo traps, our understanding of the overall condition of the snow leopard population in the Kolsai-Kolderi area has changed dramatically. While earlier, when we counted them using the WRC method, we couldn't examine the whole park's area and thought that there were not more than 5 of them here. The photo traps, which can operate continuously for 6 months on one battery, allowed us to identify 15 to 17 of them.
Мы смогли подсчитать количество снежных барсов от 15 до 17 особей.
The gorge gradually narrows down, and we are rising above 2,000 meters above sea level. The horse trail loops amidst thick coniferous forest. The tracks are a little covered with snow, but still look fresh. It starts snowing, and in a mere couple of hours it turns into a real blizzard. Coniferous forests are typical morel habitat. Morel is the largest of the noble deer species. Paleontologists believe that as a species the noble deer appeared in the mountains of Central Asia and then migrated to Northern America via the Bering Isthmus. American wapiti is a close relative of our morel. The team ascends the southern slope. There's no snow here, and it's much easier to choose a convenient place to set up the camp. Checking photo traps is one of the most exciting stages of the expedition. We installed it on the ridge, where we saw leopard's tracks. More often, it crosses the ridge, then follows the trail. There were wolf tracks as well. This trap has dozens of morale images, but not a single picture of a snow leopard. Let's check out another trap. The researchers log the GPS coordinates of all encounter points and carefully map them. Here's one. Just one. Let me have another look. No kittens. It means it's a loner. January the 7th, 2020. Losha, could you tell me the date when the boar had passed by here? I didn't put it down. A couple more photo traps on the very top we'll inspect tomorrow. Now it's time to think about our accommodation for the night. The last thing to save on planning to spend a night in the mountains in winter is your sleeping bag. The morning brings a couple of surprises. Who's grazing over there? A group of boars. How many? About 10. Sometimes snow leopards do hunt boars. Yet it's their secondary type of prey. The main food is mountain goats. They look pretty well fed. The wind is blowing from our point. If we stay here, they'll probably come towards us. On steep rocks, mountain goats can escape wolves, but not snow leopards. Both ibexes and leopards are great climbers. There were cases when both goats and leopards died slipping off from cliffs. The weather is getting worse. A couple more photo traps to check and we will be descending.
На кордоне ночевать, конечно, лучше, чем...
Surely in such a weather it's better to overnight at the checkpoint than in the tent. We are approaching the Uruk-T checkpoint located on the Sheyenne River. There's a hunter's lodge and a hotel for tourists, although the only heating source is the fireplace. During the winter, the house has frozen through, but the burning fireplace makes it really warm and cozy. High up, it gets dark early, giving travelers enough time for all the interesting stories. When I saw those fresh tracks, I really wanted to catch up with it. I felt like it was just a few hundred meters ahead of me. Altenbeck and Saltorre have a lot of mountain adventure stories in stock, with starring bears and snow leopards. We in our turn are sharing our impressions of the last trip to the national parks of North America. Mutual exchange of information never hurts. Different countries have different laws, cultures, and different traditions. Yet, successful national parks can be found across the world. The Outdoor World team went to the US to get acquainted with the oldest and most successful system of national parks. Our eco tour started in the city of Reno, at a supermarket's parking lot. A stack of Canadian geese occupied the roadway, so the drivers had to patiently wait for the birds to cross the road. That episode made us take a different look at Reno residents. If you're not going through the city center with giant casinos and hotels, its outskirts against the background of the Sierra Nevada mountains can be confused with any village in the Transilli-Alatau foothills. In the 50s, the mafia controlled this world gambling center. Now it has become a tourist mecca. Millions of visitors come to dozens of large and small specially protected natural areas in western Nevada. Nevada deserts and the barbed trees of the Joshua Tree National Park are all left behind. We have reached the snowy shores of Lake Tahoe. Several protected areas are located around the lake, yet most of the adjacent land has the status of national woods. Category 6 of specially protected areas, which are basically federal lands where sustainable nature management is allowed. National woods are managed by the United States Forest Service. We were able to talk to Mr. Robert Harper, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of the United States Forest Service.
Asked to distinguish between national parks, national forests, and wilderness areas. The question also came in about preserves, and I'll address that maybe separately. So in the United States, there's what we have is different legislation that creates different agencies in different categories of lands that are public lands. So the national parks in the United States were created under a different series of laws passed by our Congress, and those laws really established the parks with a mission around preservation and public enjoyment.
The term wilderness area is used in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. It refers to a category of nature areas where any type of activities which can potentially change local ecosystems is prohibited by law. Primitive recreation like fishing, hunting, picking mushrooms and berries, as well as living like people did before the technological revolution is possible. Yet no new roads, modern buildings or any other ways of transforming the landscape are allowed.
In the federal system, we've got several different designations, but reserves isn't one of them. We often have the national parks. We've got the national forests, which are most of the designations. We also have something called national wildlife refuges, are probably the big three that we have. And wilderness areas can be designated in all those. There's also within the wilderness areas, within the parks, there's sometimes other special designations like wild and scenic river corridors.
The term Organic Act refers to a congressional decision governing the administrative division and administration of the U.S. territory. Many national parks were established based on this act.
Hunting reserves, non-hunting areas, and community reserves. We've got some different words that we use in the United States.
There are over 100 types of specially protected areas in the U.S. There are even private and public reserves and wildlife sanctuaries. Environmentalist clubs and societies buy land and establish whatever ecological regime on them they desire. According to the classification of the International Union for Nature Conservation, Category 1A reserves possess the highest conservation status. All economic activities, even tourism, are prohibited there. Nature reserves belong to Category 1B with limited ecotourism allowed. National parks fall within Category 2. Here, the protection of ecosystems is combined with tourism. Sanctuaries belong to Category 4 and aim to preserve habitats and species by their active management.
So where I go with this is, of the maybe 600 million acres of federal public land in this country, It's almost managed by a series of zones that were identified by some often painful compromises along the way that try to strike some balance amongst those who would like to use and occupy the public lands for some degree of profit, and those that we try to keep open and available for the public, just all the public, to enjoy for other generally recreational purposes.
100 years ago, they called environmentalists turncoats on the way towards progress. Yet today, environmental science, or ecology, has transformed from a poor stepdaughter of applied sciences into an influential business lady with a swing vote in business and in politics. Modern turnover of hunting, fishing, and ecotourism in the US has reached $140 billion.
А еще сегодня утром 5 часов назад мы бродили по пояс в снегу.
As early as this morning, just 5 hours ago, we were making our way through the Sierra Nevada mountains near Lake Tahoe, waist deep in snow. And now we are in the coastal valleys of California on the shore of Clear Lake. Subtropical climate, palm trees, cypress, and just a couple of hours away from the Pacific coast. California's Clear Lake State Park was established to preserve the population of the American white pelican. The park's protection regime is rather interesting. During hatching, visitors' access to water is limited, but after the youngsters take wing, the lake turns into a popular water-based recreation site. There are 150 campsites around the lake. Sports fishing is allowed too. In autumn, the hunting season for pronghorned antelopes and deer opens. In the lake's vicinity, hunters annually hunt up to 3,000 deer. Yet, their population is not decreasing because of that, but has remained stable for decades. The Trinidad Recreation Zone near the town of Sherry also possesses the conservation status of a national coast of specially protected nature areas. Currently, the picturesque beaches are almost deserted, but in summer hundreds of thousands of tourists come to enjoy them. The luckiest ones can even see whales and seal beds from steep rocks. As we move north, the landscape is changing. We're entering the humid coastal forest belt. This is the village of Garberville. Plenty of cafes, hotels and motels on both sides of the street. Let's have a bite. The Redwood National Park has retained the features of an authentic primitive forest. Some of the Jurassic Park and Avatar scenes were shot here. The Indians came here thousands of years ago and used sequoia trees for construction without any serious damage to nature. Ecological equilibrium was ensured by the fact that each tribe was rather vigilant in protecting their hunting grounds from neighbors. The Indians were well aware of the ecological term land capacity, and those willing to exceed it risked decorating a local chief's teepee with their scalps. In 1850, the Golden Rush came to these ends and thousands of gold prospectors streamed into local forests. In a matter of years, the construction boom took an irreparable toll on sequoia woods. Only in 1921, the government started buying land from private owners for the purpose of establishing a national park. The process was by far an easy one, and it was not until 1968 that President Lyndon Johnson signed the decree establishing the Redwood National Park.
I'd say the one thing that guides how we make those decisions is really in the U.S. probably the cornerstone of our environmental legislation, and it's called the National Environmental Policy Act. And fundamentally, what the National Environmental Policy Act requires that we do when we evaluate any discretionary proposal like that is that we analyze the effects using the best science, and we disclose those effects to the public.
Our dream is to see the Roosevelt's muntjac or Roosevelt's barking deer, the rarest and largest of the wapiti subspecies living in northwestern rainforests. We thought that photo hunting for a rare deer species would take us a lot of effort and time, but it turned out that in national parks, rare deer peacefully graze along the roads. The Jedediah Smith Park welcomed us with a so-so weather, but it's still very beautiful here. Soon we will reach the river bank. The park was named after the American pioneer, hunter and mapmaker Jedediah Smith. In the spring of 1823, Smith's squad went down the Missouri to the mouth of the Grand River, where he got into an armed conflict with the Arikara Indians. They were unhappy about the fact that trappers were selling guns to their enemies, the tribe of Sioux. The Arikara attacked the trapper boats and killed about 15 people. Close to the Sheyenne River, a grizzly bear attacked Jedediah Smith, broke his ribs, ripped open his stomach and almost scalped him. Seriously wounded, the hunter walked 300 kilometers and survived.
Это река Смитов, 20 километрами ниже она впадает.
This is the Smith River. 20 kilometers downstream it flows into the Pacific.
Нерест, тихоокеанский.
Pacific salmon uses it for spawning.
Ну вот если нам сейчас повезет, то можем.
If we are lucky, we might even see a fish or two.
Разрешенная рыбалка.
Catch and release fishing is allowed here. After spawning, salmon dies. At this time, bears rush to the river banks for a feast.
Здесь платная стоянка, визит-центр. Заплатить нужно 8.
There is a visit center here. After paying $8, we can put up our tent here.
С палаткой.
Along the river, there are 8 walking routes, from 1 to 9 kilometers long. You can put up tents and make fire only in specially designated places. The first specially protected areas appeared in the US in 1872. In the 60s of the last century, they occupied 2.4 million square kilometers. And now, their area has reached 18.8 million, or about 20% of the entire country's territory. Although the outdoor world is primarily devoted to Kazakhstan's natural resources and not these of the US or other countries, in certain episodes we will tell you about some of the successful nature protection practices used abroad, hoping that raising awareness of the global experience will help us better preserve our own nature. Every expedition comes to an end. Our trip to the US and our journey to the land of snow leopard are over too. Yet the new knowledge and the new perspective of our strange and beautiful world that we gained will definitely make our lives more complete.